In the unforgiving heart of the American West, a town's justice was as sharp and brutal as a shard of broken glass. When Elara Vance, a woman of books and quiet dignity, dared to defy the most powerful man in the territory, her punishment was not the gallows or the lash. It was a sentence designed to shatter her soul, a forced marriage to a captured, wounded Comanche warrior, a man her people saw as less than human. They left her in a dusty, isolated shack with a dying enemy expecting her to break. They expected tears, madness, and a slow, miserable end. But they never expected the truth of the man behind the wounds, and they never ever expected the woman she would become. This is the story of how a cruel punishment forged an unbreakable love and ignited a fire that would change the valley forever. The sun over Redemption Gulch was a merciless anvil, hammering heat and dust into every corner of the squalid settlement. It was a town built on greed and governed by the whims of one man, Jedediah Thorne. His vast cattle empire, the Double T Ranch, was a shadow that fell over every homestead, every business, every soul. To cross Thorne was to invite ruin, a truth Elara Vance was learning in the most public and humiliating way possible. She stood on the crude platform in front of the saloon, the jeers and whispers of the townsfolk, a physical force against her skin. Her calico dress, usually so meticulously kept, was stained with dust and sweat. Her auburn hair, normally pinned in a neat bun, had come loose, framing a face pale with defiance, but shadowed by a deep, gut-wrenching fear. Beside her, Sheriff Brody, a man whose spine was made of jelly and whose loyalty was paid for by Thorne's coin, read the verdict. It wasn't a legal document, it was an edict. For the crime of aiding and abetting the flight of the Miller family, thereby denying a lawful debt to Mr. Jedediah Thorne. The sheriff droned, avoiding her gaze, and for displaying flagrant insubordination against the established order of this community, Elara Vance is found deserving of a lesson in humility and obedience. The crime, as Thorne had framed it, was simple. The Millers' good people with 3 small children had their farm on a patch of land with the only reliable stream for miles. Thorne wanted it. He had manufactured a debt, a crushing sum they could never repay, and was set to seize their property. Elara, the former schoolteacher, whose father had filled her head with notions of justice and literature, had helped them. She'd given them her savings, a meager amount, but enough for them to pack a wagon in the dead of night and flee west toward a future they might actually own. She had chosen a family's hope over a tyrant's will. Jedediah Thorne leaned against a porch post of the saloon, a thick cigarillo clamped between his teeth. He was a bull of a man with a florid face and eyes as small and cold as pebbles. He had wanted Elara not just for her striking, quiet beauty, but as another possession, another testament to his power. Her refusal of his advances had been a private sting. Her public defiance was an open wound to his pride. The gallows would have been too quick, too clean. He had devised something far more cruel, a punishment that would unfold over time, a living spectacle of her degradation. Her sentence, the sheriff continued, his voice cracking slightly, is to be bound in matrimony to the savage currently held in the old smithy. She will be his wife, his nursemaid, his keeper. She will live with him on the parcel of land at the edge of the Dust Devil Flats until such time as he expires or she learns the true meaning of compliance. A collective gasp rippled through the crowd, followed by a wave of cruel laughter and shocked murmurs. The savage was a Comanche warrior, the sole survivor of a skirmish with Thorne's outriders a week prior. They had paraded him through town, a trophy of their dominance. He was grievously wounded, a festering gash in his thigh, that most assumed would kill him within days. To marry Elara to him was to chain her to a corpse, to condemn her to an exile in her own community, forever tainted by association. It was a sentence of social death, designed to be more agonizing than a physical one. Elara's breath hitched. She had seen the prisoner, a fleeting glimpse of a proud, pain-racked face before he was thrown into the darkness of the abandoned blacksmith's shop. The thought was so monstrous, so far beyond the pale of civilized behavior, that she couldn't fully process it. "You can't," she whispered, her voice a dry rasp. Thorn pushed himself off the post and walked toward the platform, his boots thudding with a heavy finality. He stopped before her, his shadow engulfing her. His breath smelled of whiskey and smoke. "Oh, I can little school-marm." He purred the sound of venomous caress. "This is my town, my law. You wanted to help the downtrodden? Well, now's your chance. Go bind yourself to that red-skin filth. Let's see how much charity you have when you're sharing a bed with him." His eyes roved over her, stripping her bare of her dignity. "Maybe," he added, his voice dropping lower, "when you're done playing nurse to a dying animal, and you've tired of the taste of dust and misery, you'll remember my offer. You might find my company preferable then." He turned to the crowd. "Let this be a warning to any of you who think my generosity is a weakness. This land belongs to me. The people on it live by my grace." He gestured to the part-time preacher, a nervous man named Reverend Michael, who also ran the general store. "Preacher, do your duty." Reverend Michael scurried forward, his Bible trembling in his hands. Two of Thorn's brutish ranch hands, Elias and Wade, stomped onto the platform. They seized Elara's arms, their grips like iron bands. She didn't struggle. A cold, hard resolve was beginning to form in the pit of her stomach, a tiny ember in the ashes of her fear. She would not give them the satisfaction of a fight. She would not scream or cry. She would walk through this fire with her head held high, even if it burned her to cinders. They dragged her through the dust toward the old smithy, the crowd parting before them like a fetid tide. The heavy wooden door groaned open, revealing a cavern of shadows, thick with the smell of sweat, blood, and infection. In the corner, on a pile of filthy straw, lay the prisoner. He was barely conscious, his breathing shallow. His dark hair was matted with grime, his powerful frame diminished by fever and pain. A crude bandage was wrapped around his thigh, soaked through with a dark, unhealthy stain. For a moment, all Elara could see was what Thorn and the others saw: a defeated enemy, a symbol of the wildness they sought to crush. But then his eyes fluttered open. For a single, fleeting second, his gaze met hers. They were not the eyes of an animal. They were deep, intelligent, and filled with a pain so profound it stole her breath. In that instant, she saw not a savage, but a man who was as much a victim of Thorn's cruelty as she was. Reverend Michael stood in the doorway, babbling verses about duty and submission, his words a meaningless drone. Elara didn't hear him. Her focus was on the wounded man on the straw. This was her sentence. This was her punishment. They had intended to chain her to a dying beast, to break her spirit in a crucible of filth and despair. But as she looked at the flicker of defiance still burning in the stranger's eyes, a different thought took root. They hadn't given her a death sentence. They had given her a purpose. The ceremony was a mockery, a blasphemous stain on the sanctity of the vows. Reverend Michael, sweating profusely under the afternoon sun, rushed through the words as if they were hot coals in his mouth. He stood in the doorway of the smithy, refusing to step inside. Elara stood just within the shadows, the stench of the place clinging to her. The groom lay insensate on his bed of straw, his fevered groans the only response to the preacher's questions. Do you, Elara Vance, take this man, to be your lawfully wedded husband?" Elara's silence stretched thick and heavy. She could feel Thorn's gaze on her back, could sense the town's collective morbid curiosity. She looked from the pathetic figure of the preacher to the wounded man. A yes would seal her fate, legitimizing this atrocity, but a no would only invite more direct physical brutality from Thorn and his men. Her defiance had to be smarter, more enduring than a single futile word of protest. "I will," she said, her voice clear and steady, though it cost her every ounce of her will. The words tasted like ash. There was no ring, no blessing, only the preacher's hasty pronouncement and the thud of the smithy door being barred from the outside. A heavy bolt scraped into place, a sound of absolute finality. She was a prisoner. For a long while, Elara simply stood there, letting her eyes adjust to the gloom. Shafts of dusty light pierced the grimy windows, illuminating a world of neglect. Old tools rusted on the walls, a massive anvil stood silent and cold in the center of the room, and cobwebs as thick as shrouds hung from the rafters. And in the corner there was the man. Her husband. Fear, cold and sharp, pricked at her resolve. She was alone, locked in with a man her people considered a mortal enemy. He was wounded now, but what if he recovered? What then's every story she had ever heard, tales of brutality and savagery whispered through her mind. But then she remembered the look in his eyes. It was not the look of a monster. Taking a tentative step, she moved closer. The smell of his wound was overwhelming, a sickly sweet odor of decay that turned her stomach. His skin, where it wasn't caked with dirt, was a feverish, dusky red. He muttered something in a language she didn't understand, his body trembling. He was dying. Thorn's punishment was predicated on that fact. He expected her to sit here and watch this man perish, to be slowly driven mad by the proximity of death. Elara's father had been a physician before he'd moved west for his wife's health, before he'd been reduced to teaching children their letters for a pittance. He had taught Elara much, not just from books, but from practice. She knew the signs of infection, the bite of fever. She also knew about herbs, about cleanliness, about the simple, desperate medicine of the frontier. Her gaze swept the smithy. In the corner was a rain barrel half full of stagnant water. Near the forge was a bucket of coal. A desperate plan began to form a rebellion, not of words, but of action. She would not let this man die. Not for his sake, not yet, but for her own. To save him would be to spit in the face of Jedediah Thorn's authority. His death was meant to be the final act of her humiliation. His life would be the first act of her defiance. She found a dented tin pail and scooped water from the barrel. It was murky, but it was water. She built a small, careful fire in the forge, using a few scraps of wood and some of the coal. It was a risk. The smoke might draw attention, but it was one she had to take. She set the pail of water over the flames to boil. Next, she tore strips from her own petticoat, sacrificing the pristine white linen without a second thought. It was the only clean cloth she had. While the water heated, she approached the man. He was larger up close, his muscles corded and strong, even in their current state of atrophy. A leather cord with a single carved bead of bone was tied around his neck. His face in repose was all harsh angles and a stubborn jaw, but it was a face etched with a history she couldn't read. "I'm not going to hurt you," she whispered, the words feeling strange and useless. I want to help." He didn't respond. His breathing was ragged. With trembling hands, she began the gruesome task of unwrapping the bandage on his thigh. It was a crude poultice of mud and leaves caked hard with dried blood and pus, As she worked it free, the stench intensified, and she had to fight back a wave of nausea. The wound beneath was horrific. The flesh was swollen, angry, and streaked with red lines of poison that crept up his leg. It was a deep cut, likely from a Bowie knife, and it was badly infected. If she didn't clean it, the infection would enter his blood, and he would be dead by morning. Her water was boiling now. She soaked one of the linen strips in the scalding water, wringing it out until it was just cool enough to handle. Taking a deep breath, she pressed the hot, damp cloth to the edge of the wound. The man's body arched in a silent scream of agony. His eyes flew open, blazing with a mixture of fevered delirium and pure primal fury. With a speed that defied his condition, his hand shot out and seized her wrist. His grip was like a manacle of hot iron. Ilara cried out more from shock than pain. He was incredibly strong. His eyes, burning with fever, locked onto hers. He said something, a harsh, guttural word. It was not a plea. It was a command, a warning. Her heart hammered against her ribs. This was it. The moment her fear had warned her about. The savage awakened. She could see the battle in his eyes, the instinct to lash out to defend himself from this new tormentor, warring with the fog of his fever. Instead of fighting, instead of screaming, she forced herself to go still. She held his gaze, her own eyes wide and honest. She didn't pull away. She let him feel the tremble in her hand, but she didn't let him see the fear in her face. "I am trying to help you," she said again, her voice low and even as if speaking to a spooked horse. "That wound will kill you. Let me clean it." He stared at her, his grip unwavering. Seconds ticked by, each one a lifetime. The forge fire crackled the only sound, besides their ragged breathing. She could see the confusion in his eyes, the effort of a keen mind fighting through a haze of pain and sickness. He was looking at her, seeing her not just as a white woman, an enemy, but as something else. Slowly, agonizingly, the pressure on her wrist lessened. His fingers uncurled and his hand fell back to the straw, the effort costing him what little strength he had left. His eyes slid closed and his head slumped to the side, though she knew he was not unconscious. He had made a choice. He was trusting her. Or perhaps he was simply too weak to fight anymore. It didn't matter. It was a start. With a shaky sigh of relief, Ilara went back to work. For the next hour, she performed the most difficult task of her life. She used the hot water and strips of her petticoat to meticulously clean the wound, flushing away the filth and pus. Each touch made him flinch, his body rigid with contained agony, but he made no further move against her. The work was grim, but it was also intimate. She was tending to the body of a man she was supposed to hate, a man who was supposed to be her punishment. When she was finished, she packed the clean wound with the only thing she could find with any medicinal properties, a thick layer of cobwebs from the rafters, an old folk remedy to staunch bleeding and draw out impurities. It was a desperate measure, but it was all she had. She bound it with the last of the clean linen. Exhausted, she slumped against the cold stone of the forge. The smithy was dark now. The fire burned down to glowing embers. Her fine dress was ruined, her hands were stained and raw, and she was locked away from the world. She was married to a man whose name she did not know, a man who might still die, a man who might kill her if he lived. By all accounts, Jedediah Thorne had won. She was broken, isolated, and shamed, but as she looked at the slightly more peaceful breathing of the man on the straw, a different feeling settled in her heart. It wasn't triumph, not yet, but it wasn't defeat either. It was the quiet, stubborn resilience of a single blade of grass pushing its way through cracked, sun-baked earth. The punishment had begun, but so had her rebellion. The days that followed bled into one another, marked only by the shifting shafts of light that crept across the smithy floor. Thorn's cruelty had been calculated. Twice a day, one of his men, usually the sneering foreman Elias, would unbar the door and leave a pail of water and a hunk of dry bread on the threshold. He never spoke to Elara, merely looked at her with contempt before sealing her back in her prison. It was enough to keep her alive, but not enough to truly live. Her life shrank to the confines of those four walls and the needs of the man in the corner. She gave him most of the water, forcing small sips between his cracked lips. She soaked the bread in water to make a soft mash, a crude gruel that he could swallow. For the first 2 days, he was lost to the fever, tossing and turning, his muttered words, a constant, unintelligible river of sound. During his fits of delirium, Elara would sit by his side, bathing his forehead with a damp rag, her presence a small, steady anchor in his storm of pain. She learned the landscape of his face, the high, sharp cheekbones, the proud arch of his nose, the fine white scar that cut through his left eyebrow. She saw the strength in the line of his jaw and the vulnerability in the way his hand would clench in the straw when a wave of pain washed over him. In these quiet, watchful hours, the label of savage dissolved completely. She saw only a human being stripped of his pride and his power, fighting for his life. On the 3rd morning, something shifted. Elara awoke from a light, fitful sleep on a pile of old grain sacks to find him watching her. The fever had broken. His eyes, though sunken and weary, were clear and lucid. The blazing delirium was gone, replaced by a calm, unnerving intelligence. Neither of them spoke. The silence was absolute, a living thing between them. It was a silence of caution, of assessment. He was judging her, his gaze missing nothing. Her tattered dress, her calloused hands, the exhaustion etched onto her face. She in turn met his gaze without flinching, hoping her eyes conveyed her intent. She was not his enemy. Slowly he pushed himself up, propping his back against the wall. The movement was a study in controlled agony, his face tightening, but he made no sound. He looked down at his bandaged leg, touching the clean linen with a hint of surprise. Then his eyes returned to her. He spoke, his voice a low, rough rasp from disuse. The word was not in his native tongue. It was English. Water. The sound of his voice, calm and rational, startled her. She quickly fetched the pail and a rusty tin cup she had scoured clean. She filled it and held it out to him. He watched her approach, his body tense, but he took the cup. His hands were unsteady, and he had to use both to bring it to his lips. He drank deeply, his throat working. When he was finished, he held the cup out for more. She refilled it twice. He handed the cup back, his fingers brushing hers for a fraction of a second. The touch was brief, accidental, but it sent a jolt through her. It was the first human contact she'd had in days that wasn't violent or contemptuous. He leaned his head back against the wall, his eyes closing for a moment. "Why?" he asked, the single word hanging in the air. Elara understood immediately. "Why did you help me? Why didn't you let me die?" She chose her words carefully. "Because my enemy's enemy is not my friend." She began, her voice quiet but firm. "But a man left to die in filth is an offense to God and to decency. The man who did this to you, he did this to me as well. Letting you die would have been his victory." He opened his eyes and studied her again, a flicker of something, surprise, respect in their dark depths. He seemed to process her words, to understand the complex truth of their shared situation. He was her husband by force, her captor by reputation, but in reality, he was her fellow prisoner. "He is Jedediah Thorn," she added. "He owns this valley." The man gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod, as if the name meant something to him. "Thorn," He repeated the name, tasting like a curse on his tongue. He looked at her, truly looked at her, and asked his next question. "Your name?" "Ilara. Ilara Vance." He considered this for a moment. "I am Kai." Just that. A single name. Kai. It felt solid, real. It replaced the faceless savage of her imagination. Kai. She now had a name for the man whose life she had saved. Their conversations after that were sparse, fragments of information exchanged in the quiet hours. He spoke English well, with a careful, deliberate cadence, as if translating thoughts from his own language. He told her little of his people or his past, and she didn't press him. Instead, they spoke of the immediate, the quality of the water, the staleness of the bread, the way the shadows moved across the floor. Ilara learned to read his silences as much as his words. She learned that a certain stillness meant his leg was causing him intense pain. She learned that the tightening of his jaw meant he was listening to the sounds outside, tracking the movements of Thorne's men. He in turn began to observe her. He watched the methodical way she organized their meager supplies, the quiet dignity with which she ate her small portion of bread. One afternoon, Elias was later than usual with their provisions. When he finally opened the door, he was drunk, his usual sneer amplified into a leering grin. "Enjoying your honeymoon, school marm," he slurred, setting the pail down with a clatter, his eyes fixated on Ilara crawling over her with a filthy familiarity. "Thorne says to tell you the offer still stands. Getting tired of your redskin pet, yet a word from you and I'll put him out of his misery myself. Then you and I could—" Before he could finish the vile suggestion, a voice cut through the air, low and dangerous. "Leave." It was Kai. He had pushed himself into a sitting position, his back ramrod straight. The fever was gone, but in its place was a cold, lethal intensity. He looked at Elias, not as a broken prisoner, but as a predator looks at prey. The authority in that single word was absolute. Elias, startled, took a step back. His drunken bravado faltered in the face of that unwavering obsidian gaze. He saw for the first time not a dying savage, but a warrior. He stammered, trying to regain his footing. "You don't give me orders, you—" "I said—" Kai repeated his voice, dropping even lower, each syllable a chip of ice. "Leave. Now." For a tense moment, the two men locked eyes. Elias, a bully, used to preying on the weak, found himself facing something he didn't understand and couldn't intimidate. With a nervous curse, he spat on the ground, turned and slammed the door, the bolt shooting home with more force than usual. Ilara let out a breath she didn't realize she'd been holding. Her heart was pounding. She looked at Kai, who was still staring at the door, his body coiled like a snake. He had defended her. It was a small act, just 2 words, but in their world it was a seismic shift. He had recognized her not just as his nurse, but as someone under his protection. "Thank you," she said softly. He turned his head, his gaze softening, almost imperceptibly, as it rested on her. He simply nodded. The silence that fell between them this time was different. It was no longer a space of caution and assessment. It was a space of shared understanding. An alliance had been forged in the gloom of the smithy. They were no longer 2 prisoners suffering in solitude. They were Ilara and Kai, and they were in this together. With the breaking of his fever, Kai's recovery accelerated, with a speed that astonished Ilara. The deep resilience of his body, honed by a life she could only imagine, fought off the last vestiges of the infection. The wound began to heal cleanly, the angry red fading to a healthy pink. With his strength returning, so too did a restless energy. The confines of the smithy, once a refuge for healing, were now becoming a cage. He began to move, testing his leg. At first it was just a few limping steps, his hand braced against the wall for support, his face a mask of grim determination. Ilara watched, saying nothing, but keeping a careful eye ready to help if he stumbled. He never did. Each day he pushed himself further, his limp lessening, his movements regaining their fluid grace. Their world was still one of routine. The clang of the bolt, the meager provisions, the long hours of silence. But the silence was now comfortable, filled with unspoken communication, a shared glance when a rider passed too close to the smithy, the small, almost invisible smile he gave her when she managed to trap a mouse under a loose floorboard, a pathetic but welcome addition to their diet of stale bread. The whispers began in earnest. The conversations that had been fragmented and cautious now deepened, flowing more easily in the quiet dark after their evening meal. He started to share pieces of his life, not in a single narrative, but in small polished stones of memory offered up for her inspection. He spoke of the vast open plains of a sky so wide it could hold all of a man's dreams. He described the thunder of a buffalo herd, a sound that you felt in your bones before you heard it with your ears. He didn't speak of battles or raids, but of tracking of patience, of understanding the language of the earth, the meaning of a broken twig, a displaced stone, the call of a hawk. Ilara, in turn, told him of her world, a world of books, of poetry, of ideas. She described the cities of the East, the crush of people, the marvel of gaslights and paved streets. She told him about her father, the gentle physician who believed knowledge was the only true freedom. She recited verses from Shakespeare and Keats, her voice soft in the firelight from the forge. Kai would listen, his head tilted, his dark eyes focused on her face. He didn't always understand the words, but he understood the music of them, the passion and sorrow they conveyed. The man who wrote those words, he said one night after she'd recited a sonnet, he saw the heart of a thing, just as a hunter sees the heart of a deer before the arrow flies. It was the most profound literary analysis she had ever heard. He saw the world through a different lens, but his perception was as sharp and insightful as any scholar she had ever known. She began to see that his wildness was simply a different kind of knowledge, a wisdom written not on paper but on the wind and the land. The dynamic between them shifted from nurse and patient, from captive and captive, to something akin to partnership. He taught her how to be silent, how to listen to the subtle sounds of the night. She taught him how to read a few simple words, scratching letters in the dirt floor with a piece of charcoal. He would trace the shapes with his finger, his brow furrowed in concentration, the warrior becoming a student. This growing bond did not go unnoticed. Jedediah Thorne had expected to hear reports of Ilara's despair of the Comanche's death. Instead, Elias brought him news of quiet defiance. They just sit in there. Elias reported frustration, lacing his voice. He's healing, boss, walking around now, and she ain't crying. She looks at me like I'm the dirt on her shoe. Thorne grew suspicious. The punishment wasn't working. It wasn't breaking her. It seemed to be forging her into something harder. And the Comanche warrior, he should have been dead. Why was he still alive? Thorne's mind, always turning on the axle of avarice, began to spin a new theory. The skirmish that had led to Kai's capture had taken place in the high country, near the forbidding ridge known as the Devil's Backbone. It was territory Thorne desperately wanted to survey. Rumor, an old prospector's tale, spoke of a hidden pass, through the ridge a shortcut that would give him access to the untouched timber and potential gold claims on the other side. His men had been searching for it when they'd run into Kai's party. What if this warrior wasn't just a random brave? What if he knew the way? What if the key to the fortune he craved was locked inside the head of the man he'd given to Ilara Vance as a torment? The irony was galling, and the opportunity was too great to ignore. The pressure on the smithy changed. It was no longer about simple humiliation. Thorn wanted information. He sent Elias to probe, to threaten. One morning, Elias didn't just leave the food. He swaggered into the smithy, a length of rope in his hand. Wade, his hulking shadow, stood in the doorway. "Morning, lovebirds," Elias sneered. "Mr. Thorn is getting impatient. He figures you—" He nodded at Kai. "Might know something he wants to know. About a certain path through the mountains." Kai stood up slowly, positioning himself between Elias and Ilara. He was still limping, but he stood tall, his presence filling the small space. "We know nothing," he said, his voice flat. "Oh, I think you do," Elias said, uncoiling the rope. "And I've got ways of making people talk. We could start with you, or maybe we could start with your pretty little wife. She looks soft. I bet she'd sing like a canary if I—" In a blur of motion, Kai moved. He didn't have a weapon, but he didn't need one. He seized the rusty lid of the coal bucket, a disc of heavy iron, and slammed it into the side of Elias's head. The foreman went down with a grunt, stunned. Kai kicked the rope from his hand and snatched up a heavy blacksmith's hammer from the floor, its weight settling comfortably in his grip. Wade in the doorway drew his pistol, but he hesitated. Kai was a whirlwind of controlled fury, a cornered wolf ready to tear out their throats. There was no fear in his eyes, only a promise of violence. Wade looked from his downed boss to the armed and furious warrior, and his courage failed him. He dragged Elias by the collar out of the smithy and slammed the door, the bolt ramming home with a sound of panic. The smithy was suddenly deathly quiet. Ilara's heart was a drum against her ribs. She looked at Kai, who stood panting slightly, the heavy hammer held loosely in his hand. He had been ready to kill for her. He had been ready to die for her. He let the hammer fall to the floor with a loud clang. He turned to her, his eyes searching her face for fear. He found none. Only a fierce, blazing pride. She stepped toward him, closing the small distance between them. She reached out and gently touched his arm, her fingers tracing the hard line of his muscle. "They will be back," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "I know," he replied, his voice rough with emotion. "They will not stop." "I know," he said again. He then looked down at her hand on his arm, and his own hand came up to cover it. His skin was warm, his touch firm and protective. "They will not harm you." It wasn't a promise. It was a vow. In that moment, the last wall between them crumbled. They were no longer just allies, no longer just prisoners. The cruel mockery of a wedding ceremony the sentence handed down in the dust had become something real. Thorn, in his infinite cruelty, had tried to bind her to a savage. He had failed. He had bound her to a man who saw her, who respected her, who would fight for her. And she, the quiet schoolteacher, was bound to a man who had shown her a strength and honor she had only ever read about in books. The whispers on the wind were no longer just their quiet conversations. They were the rumors of a storm, gathering a storm that was about to break over Redemption Gulch. The failed attempt at intimidation marked a turning point. The pretense was over. Thorn no longer viewed the occupants of the smithy as a lesson in humility, but as an obstacle and a resource. The serpent's shadow, which had always loomed over the valley, now coiled specifically around their small, dark world. The day after the confrontation, the provisions stopped. It was a simple, brutal tactic. Starvation. Thorn knew they couldn't last long without food and water. He would let hunger and thirst break them where threats and taunts had failed. The first day was marked by a gnawing anxiety. Ilara and Kai rationed the last of their water a few mouthfuls each. The stale bread was long gone. By evening, a deep, cramping hunger had set in. The second day was worse. Thirst became a physical torment, their throats raw, their lips cracking. The air in the smithy grew hot and close, each breath a dusty effort. Kai spent hours at the grimy windows, his eyes narrowed, studying the patterns of the guards Thorn had posted just out of rifle range. He noted when they changed shifts, when their attention wandered. He was no longer just a prisoner. He was a tactician, planning a campaign. "He thinks he can wait," Kai said, his voice a dry rasp as they sat in the dwindling light of the second day. "He thinks the desert is his ally. But the desert has taught me patience he cannot understand." That night, under the sliver of a new moon, Kai put his knowledge into action. He showed Ilara how to pry up one of the thick floorboards in the corner of the smithy. Beneath was cool, damp earth. Using a shard of metal he'd found, he began to dig. It was slow, arduous work in the dark. He was searching for something she couldn't comprehend. "In this land," he explained, his voice low as he worked, "life follows water, even when you cannot see it. Old roots run deep." Hours later, his hand stopped. He had found it, a thick, gnarled root from a long-dead cottonwood tree. With painstaking effort, he severed a piece of it. He showed Ilara how to chew on the fibrous pulp, which released a trickle of precious, slightly bitter moisture. It wasn't water, but it was enough to wet their mouths, to stave off the worst of the dehydration. It was a miracle born of ancient knowledge. For food, he turned his attention to the rats that skittered in the walls. He fashioned a simple but effective snare from a strip of his own leather leggings and a bit of wire he'd stripped from a broken bellows. By dawn they had 2 small rats. Ilara, who once would have shrieked at the sight of one, now watched with grim focus as Kai expertly skinned and cleaned them. They cooked the tiny morsels over a nearly smokeless fire of dry coals, the smell of roasting meat, a tantalizing agony. The meal was meager, but it was a victory. It was sustenance Thorn hadn't provided. They were surviving. But it was more than that. They were fighting back with wits and resilience. The shared hardship, the desperate intimacy of their survival, fused them together in a way that comfort and peace never could. One evening, as they sat sharing the last piece of cooked root, Ilara found herself studying the way the faint light from the forge caught the planes of his face. The fear she once felt was a distant memory replaced by a deep, aching tenderness that frightened her in a different way. He looked up and caught her gaze. In his eyes, she saw her own feelings mirrored. He reached out his hand, gently cupping her jaw, his thumb stroking her cheek. The gesture was infinitely gentle, a stark contrast to the harshness of their world. "Ilara," he said, his voice thick with an emotion he rarely showed. He leaned in and kissed her. It was not a kiss of passion, but of profound connection. It was a kiss of shared desperation and shared hope, a promise made in the dark that they would not be broken. It was the taste of dust and thirst and the undeniable, unquenchable will to live. Meanwhile, Thorn's frustration was mounting. Days passed, and there was no sign of surrender from the smithy. His guards reported seeing smoke, but no white flag. He couldn't understand it. They should have been skeletons by now. His simple siege was failing, making him look foolish. His greed warred with his pride. He needed the information Kai possessed. The pass through the devil's backbone was becoming an obsession. He imagined the wealth, the power, the expansion of his empire. The thought of this lone Comanche warrior and a stubborn schoolteacher denying him that future was intolerable. He decided on a new, more direct approach. If they wouldn't break, he would shatter them. Sheriff Brody, His face pale and sweating delivered the ultimatum. He didn't dare enter the smithy, shouting the message through the heavy door. "Thorn's done waiting. He wants the Comanche. He gives you till sunrise tomorrow. You open this door and hand him over, and he'll let you go, Vance. He'll give you a horse and provisions, and you can ride out of here. He gives his word." "His word is worthless," Ilara shouted back, her voice ringing with contempt. "You don't understand?" Brody's voice was desperate. "If you don't, he's taking him by force, and he's going to burn this place to the ground with you inside it. He means it, Ilara. This is your last chance." The sheriff's footsteps retreated, leaving a heavy silence in their wake. Ilara looked at Kai. His face was grim, his jaw set like granite. "He's giving you a way out," Kai said quietly, his eyes searching hers. "You could be free of this." Ilara stepped toward him, her own eyes blazing. "Free to ride away and let him torture you to death, to live with myself, knowing I traded your life for my own safety. That isn't freedom, Kai. That's just a different kind of prison." She placed her hands on his chest. "You told me you would not let them harm me. And I am telling you now I will not let them take you. We started this together. We will finish it together." A slow, fierce smile spread across Kai's face. It was the first time she had seen him truly smile, and it transformed him. The grim warrior vanished, and in his place was a man filled with a light that pushed back the shadows. "Thorn thinks he has us trapped in here," Kai said, his voice resonating with a new energy. "He is wrong. He has given us a forge, a hammer, and a fire. He has given us the tools to craft our own escape." He looked around the smithy, his eyes not seeing a prison, but an arsenal. The heavy chains, the sharpened tools, the bellows that could breathe life into a fire. Thorn's shadow had brought them to the brink, but it had also inadvertently given them everything they needed. Sunrise was coming, and with it, a reckoning. They would not wait for Thorn to bring the fire to them. They would walk out to meet him, surrounded by a fire of their own making. The hours before dawn were a blur of focused, desperate activity. Kai and Ilara transformed their prison into an arsenal. The clang of a blacksmith's hammer on iron echoed in the gloom as Kai armed himself with the hammer itself. For Ilara, he sharpened a farrier's rasp, a vicious, pointed weapon for close quarters. While he worked, she fed the forge with the bellows, her fear replaced by a cold, hard resolve. Their plan was audacious, born of a warrior's cunning. Thorn wanted a fire, so they would give him an inferno, using it as both a weapon and a shield. At sunrise, Thorn and a dozen of his men surrounded the smithy, their voices full of arrogant confidence. "Time's up! Send out the savage!" Thorn roared. His command was answered not by a plea, but by the whoosh of flames. Ilara had thrown a ladle of white-hot coals onto the oil-soaked rags they'd prepared. The back wall of the smithy erupted in fire. Believing their prisoners were trapped, Thorn's men cheered and used a log to batter down the door. They burst in to face a scene from hell. A wall of fire roared behind a curtain of blinding, choking smoke. Out of that maelstrom charged Kai. He was not a wounded captive, but a spectre of vengeance, the heavy hammer swinging in brutal, efficient arcs. The first man's knee shattered with a sickening crunch. The second went down with a crushed shoulder. The shock of the assault threw Thorn's men into chaos. They had expected victims, not a furious armed warrior emerging from the flames. In the confusion, Ilara slipped out, shielded by a water-soaked blanket. A ranch hand grabbed her, and she reacted instantly, driving the rasp into his thigh. He screamed and released her, but her movement had drawn the one eye that mattered. Jedediah Thorn, his face contorted with rage, raised his pistol. He fired not at Kai, but at the woman whose defiance had cost him everything. A searing pain exploded in Ilara's arm, and she crumpled to the dust. Seeing her fall, Kai let out a roar of pure rage and charged Thorn, only to be tackled by the foreman Elias. As they wrestled, Thorn took aim to finish the job, but he had forgotten Ilara's fire. Fueled by adrenaline, she scrambled to her feet, ran at the tyrant, and plunged the rasp into his gun arm. Thorn bellowed as his pistol dropped. The sight of their injured leader and the ferocity of their two opponents broke the men's will. Amid the chaos, Kai threw Elias off, rushed to Ilara, and quickly bandaged her bleeding arm. He half-carried her to the stables, and moments later, they were on a single horse, galloping west toward the Devil's Backbone. They left behind the pillar of smoke that had been their prison, riding away not as victims, but as victors. The ride into the high country was a fever dream for Ilara, her world a blur of pain, until Kai found refuge in a hidden canyon. There he proved himself a healer, as well as a warrior. With a skill born of necessity, he removed the bullet from her arm, and with remedies of bark and leaf, nursed her through the dangerous fever that followed. In her delirium she heard his voice, a steady anchor in a storm of pain. Once her strength returned, he led her to the fabled pass through the Devil's Backbone. The narrow fissure in the rock opened into a world she thought only existed, in dreams a pristine valley, a sanctuary of impossible green, untouched by the outside world. "This is the land of my ancestors," Kai explained, his voice filled with reverence. Here they built a new life. He taught her the language of the earth, which plants healed, which nourished, and how to move with the seasons. In turn, she brought a sense of home to their small shelter, her quiet resilience, a source of constant strength. The woman forged in the fire of the smithy thrived, and their love born in desperation now blossomed in profound peace. One evening, watching the sunset paint the peaks, Ilara touched the scar on her arm. It was a reminder not of what she had lost, but of all she had become. "Thorn punished you by making you marry me," Kai said softly. "He thought he was sentencing you to hell." Ilara leaned her head on his shoulder, looking out at their paradise, her heart full. "He did," she whispered. "He just didn't realize one man's hell could be another woman's heaven." So ends the story of Ilara and Kai, a testament to the fact that even in the most brutal of circumstances, the human spirit can find a way not only to survive, but to flourish. What began as a cruel punishment, an act of supreme arrogance by a petty tyrant, backfired in the most spectacular way. It didn't break Ilara. It freed her from a world of hypocrisy and unleashed a strength she never knew she possessed. It didn't degrade her. It led her to a love more real and profound than any she could have found in the so-called civilized world. Their story reminds us that true savagery often wears a suit and a self-righteous smile, while true honor can be found in the most unexpected of places. It's a powerful lesson from the forgotten corners of the Wild West. What part of Ilara and Kai's journey moved you the most? Was it her defiance, his resilience, or the quiet way they built a life from the ashes of their old one? Let us know in the comments below. If this story of survival and unlikely love resonated with you, please give this video a thumbs up. Share it with someone who appreciates a powerful story, and be sure to subscribe for more tales from the untamed heart of history.